She didn't turn off the shop light. That was the thing people always asked about later. Why the light was still on at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in the middle of October, when every other business on Route 9 had been dark for hours. Tessa Bowman didn't have a complicated answer. She'd been halfway through pulling a cracked caliper off a '09 Ram when the rain started, and she'd told herself she'd finish the job and then close up. That was 2 hours ago. The caliper was done. The truck was sitting in Bay 2 with new hardware and fresh brake fluid. And Tessa was still there, sitting on an overturned milk crate beside the workbench, reading a letter she'd already read 4 times. The letter was from Coldwater Savings and Loan. It had the kind of language in it that sounds polite but means something terrible. Words like outstanding balance and notice of intent in 90 days. Tessa had set it down on the bench next to a can of brake cleaner and a socket wrench, and she'd read it again, and then she'd sat there for a while without reading anything at all. Bowman Auto had been on this stretch of highway for 31 years. Her father, Gene Bowman, had opened it when Tessa was 3 years old, in a building that used to be a feed storage shed before he'd converted it himself. One weekend at a time, with a second-hand lift and a hand-painted sign he'd made on a piece of plywood. Gene had worked that shop until the arthritis in his hands got bad enough that he couldn't grip a torque wrench anymore. And then Tess had taken over. First summers in high school, then full-time at 22, when she'd come back from 2 years at the technical college in Abilene, and Gene had handed her the keys without ceremony, the way he did most things. She was 29 now. The mortgage on the property was behind by 4 months. The letter said 90 days. But Tessa knew what 90 days meant when you were already 4 months in the hole, and the slow season was just beginning. Outside, the rain picked up. She folded the letter and set it back on the bench and picked up the socket wrench again, not because she had anything left to do with it, just because it felt better to be holding something. That was when she heard the motorcycles. Not 1, not 2. 7 or 8 of them by the sound, all pulling into the gravel lot at once. Engines dropping from a roar to an idle to nothing. Tessa didn't move for a moment. She listened to the rain on the corrugated metal roof, and then she heard boots on wet gravel, and then someone knocked on the frame of the open bay door. He was a big man. Not tall exactly, but wide across the shoulders in the way of someone who had done physical work his whole life and never quite stopped. He was probably 50, with a short gray beard and road grime on his face and a cut that said Iron Hammer MC across the back. He was holding his helmet in both hands the way you'd hold a hat in church. "Sorry to bother you," he said. "We saw the light." Tessa looked past him. There were 8 of them, all standing in the gravel under the rain, none of them moving toward the building. 6 men, 2 women, all of them wet. One of them, a younger man near the back, was being held upright by the 2 people on either side of him, and the way he was holding his arm against his chest wasn't right. "How bad is he?" Tessa said. The big man looked back over his shoulder. "He came off on the 78 overpass, slid on something. His shoulder's wrong, and we think maybe a rib. He's been coherent, but he's getting cold, and we're still 40 miles from Fredericksburg." Tessa set down the socket wrench. "Bring him in," she said. The big man blinked, like he'd expected something else. "Ma'am, bring him in out of the rain," Tessa said. "The rest of you too. I've got a space heater and a first aid kit, and I can take a look at him." His name was Arlo Voss. He was 26, and he'd been riding for 4 years, and he'd gone down at about 50 miles an hour when the front tire hit a slick of standing water on the bridge, and the bike went sideways before he had any real chance to react. The Iron Hammer MC had been riding back from a rundown near Uvalde, 12 of them when they'd started out. Now 8 because 4 had turned back earlier when the weather got bad. Tessa got him into the shop and onto a folding chair near the space heater and had a look. Was not a doctor, but her father had taught her field medicine the same way he taught her everything else. Practically, directly, with the understanding that knowing how to handle a situation was always better than not knowing. Gene Bowman had been an Army medic in the late 70s before he'd come home to Texas and opened a garage, and he'd believed that skill was skill and didn't belong to any one profession. Arlo's right shoulder was dislocated. She could see it in the way the joint sat, the slight drop of the arm, the way he flinched when she moved it gently, and didn't flinch much at all when she moved it the other way, which told her something about where the dislocation was. His ribs were bruised, but she didn't think anything was broken. His breathing was even, and he wasn't guarding hard enough for a fracture. "I can reduce the shoulder," she said. "It's going to hurt for about 10 seconds, and then it's going to feel a lot better. You want me to try, or you want to wait for the hospital?" Arlo looked at her. He had road rash on the left side of his face, and he was still shaking slightly from the cold. "You've done this before?" he said. "My dad dislocated his shoulder 3 times in 8 years, Tessa said. "The 3rd time he did it himself in the shop, and I was the only one here, and he walked me through it. I was 17. Arlo considered this for a moment. "Okay," he said. It took 12 seconds, not 10. But when it was done, Arlo sat up straighter and breathed differently, a long exhale like a pressure valve releasing, and said, "Oh, yeah, yeah." Tessa wrapped his ribs with an elastic bandage from the kit and gave him 2 ibuprofen from the bottle she kept in her desk drawer and told him to stay still. The big man, His name was Russell Briggs, and he was the chapter president, which Tessa learned later, had been watching from a few feet away with his arms folded and a look on his face she couldn't quite read. "You know," he said, "most people would have called the county and waited. Most people don't have a first aid kit that size." Tessa said, which was true. She kept it well stocked because the shop was 11 miles from the nearest urgent care, and she'd stitched her own palm twice and once had to pack a cut on a customer's hand when a fan belt let go while he was leaning over the engine. "You learned what you needed to learn." Russell Briggs looked at her a moment longer, and then he nodded, and that seemed to be the end of that. She made coffee. It was the least she could do, and it was also all she had, except for half a bag of white bread and some peanut butter in the desk drawer next to the ibuprofen. She put those out too, without making a thing of it, and one of the women, a woman named Deb, with silver-streaked hair and a calm, steady way about her, helped without being asked, spreading peanut butter on bread and passing the slices around like it was a normal kitchen and not a garage in the middle of the night in the middle of a storm. They spread out around the shop. Two of them sat on the floor with their backs against the tire rack. A couple more pulled shop stools up near the heater. Nobody touched anything. Nobody got in the way of each other's space. Tessa noticed that. She'd had cause to notice the way people behaved in her shop, which machines they reached for without asking, which they stepped around, whether they treated the space with care or like it was just background. These people treated it with care. She went back to her workbench and sat on the milk crate and thought about the letter. Russell came and stood near her after a while, not close, just near. "What's that?" he said, nodding at the folded paper. Tessa hadn't meant to leave it visible. She picked it up and set it in the drawer. "Nothing," she said. Russell didn't push it. He looked around the shop, at the family photos pinned above the workbench, at the framed snapshot of Gene in his army uniform, at the hand-painted wooden sign that said Bowman Auto. Honest work, fair price, and had been hanging over the tool cabinet since before Tessa could read. "Your place," he said. "My dad's," Tessa said. "I run it now." "How long?" 7 years full-time, 31 years in the family. Russell was quiet for a moment. "That sign painted by hand?" "He made it himself, before he opened." Tessa paused. "He's in a care facility in Kerrville now, Parkinson's. But he used to come by on Tuesdays. He'd sit in that chair." She nodded toward the folding chair where Arlo was sitting and drink coffee and watch me work. Didn't say much, just like being here. Russell didn't say anything to that, but he nodded in a way that meant he understood something about it. The storm didn't let up until close to 2 in the morning. Tessa had a cot in the back room. She'd slept on it a few times when she'd had early jobs, and it didn't make sense to drive home. And she offered it to Deb, who took it without fuss. The others arranged themselves around the shop in whatever configuration was comfortable. Arlo stretched out carefully in the back seat of the Ram, which was still up on the lift, which made the whole thing look slightly absurd, and also turned out to be one of the warmer spots in the building. Tessa didn't sleep. She went through her parts inventory at the workbench with a flashlight, which was something she'd been meaning to do for weeks, and she listened to the rain ease off and thought about what she was going to do about cold water, savings, and loan. The honest answer was she didn't know. She'd called twice and gotten the same script both times. There were options available to customers experiencing financial hardship. There was a process, there were forms. The forms led to more forms, and the options available turned out to be another loan to cover the first loan, which wasn't really an option at all. Her neighbor 2 lots down, the man who ran the feed store, had offered to loan her money personally, but that felt like something she couldn't do. Her father had built this place without owing anyone anything outside a bank, and the bank was at least impersonal about it. She was thinking about this when she realized someone else was awake. A young woman named Carla had been sitting against the far wall for the last hour, not sleeping, watching the rain through the gap in the bay door. She was maybe 23, with short-cropped hair and the kind of stillness in her face that suggested she was used to keeping things inside. "Can't sleep?" Tessa said. "Nah," Carla said. "Never good on the road." Tessa didn't pry. She went back to her inventory. But after a while, Carla said quietly, "How long has it been yours? The shop?" 7 years, Tessa said. "You like it?" Tessa thought about that the way she thought about most things, directly. "I love it," she said. "I loved it when I was 12 and my dad let me hand him tools and I didn't even know what I was handing him. I love it now when it's 2 in the morning and I'm sitting here wondering if I'm going to lose it." She hadn't meant to say that last part, but it was 2 in the morning and she was tired and she'd said it anyway. Carla looked at her. "Is that what the letter was?" "Yeah," Tessa said. Carla nodded slowly, the way young people nod when they're processing something they understand better than you expected them to. "My dad had a diner," she said, "in Seguin. He fought for it for 2 years and then it went. I was 16. She paused. "I still drive past where it was. There's a cell phone store there now." Tessa didn't say anything. She thought about the sign above the tool cabinet. "I'm sorry," she said. "Me too," Carla said. They sat in the quiet shop for a while, with the rain coming down soft now, almost done. At 5:30, the sky outside went from black to deep gray to the particular shade of pale orange that meant the sun was coming, even if you couldn't see it yet through the overcast. Tessa made a second pot of coffee and the group stirred one by one, people sitting up and stretching and checking their phones. Arlo walked out of the Ram's back seat slowly but under his own power. His shoulder was stiff, but he said it was manageable. Tessa put his left arm in a makeshift sling from a strip of clean shop rag and gave him the rest of the ibuprofen and told him he needed to see a doctor when they got to Fredericksburg and not to do anything with that arm in the meantime. Yes, ma'am, Arlo said. I mean it, Tessa said. The reduction holds, but the joint is going to be inflamed for a week. You rest it. Yes, ma'am, Arlo said again, and from the way he said it, she believed him. Russell Briggs stood by the bay door with his coffee and looked out at the clearing sky. The parking lot was still wet and the gravel gleamed in the early light, and the 9 motorcycles were lined up in the lot where they'd been all night, none of them touched, none of them tipped. Tessa noticed he was looking at them the way you look at something you're responsible for. Thank you, he said without turning around. I mean it. We'd have been out there in that for another hour waiting on the county. It was fine, Tessa said. I was here anyway. Russell turned. He looked at her directly for a moment with the flat, evaluating look of someone who was deciding how to say something. Is the shop going to be okay? He said. Tessa almost said yes. It was a reflex, the same reflex that had made her say nothing when he'd asked about the letter. But something about the way he asked it, directly without fuss, the same way she might ask whether a brake line was holding, made the reflex not quite fire. Probably not, she said. Not without something changing, but I'm working on it. Russell nodded once. He drained his coffee and set the cup down on the workbench with care. Okay, he said. We'll be out of your way. They filed out one by one, stopping at the door. Deb thanked her. 2 of the men she hadn't spoken to directly offered handshakes, which she took. Carla stopped last, and she looked at Tessa for a second, and then she hugged her briefly, with the slightly awkward efficiency of someone who didn't hug often, and then she walked out to her bike. Tessa stood at the bay door and watched them start their engines and pull out onto Route 9, one by one heading north. She went back inside and sat on the milk crate. She thought about calling her father. He was usually awake early, and he liked to talk in the mornings before the day got heavy, but it was barely 6 and she didn't want to wake him. She picked up the letter from Coldwater Savings and Loan and read it one more time. Then she put it in the drawer and went to find out if she had enough coffee for a third pot. 3 days passed. She fixed a transmission on a Silverado, replaced wheel bearings on an F-150, and did 2 oil changes and a state inspection. She ate lunch at her desk both days and spent her evenings going through the finances the way she'd been going through them for the last 3 months. Looking for somewhere to cut, somewhere to move money from, somewhere the numbers might add up differently than they had the last time she'd looked. They didn't add up differently. On the 4th day, she was under a Jeep Grand Cherokee when she heard it. 1 motorcycle at first, then 2, then more. She came out from under the Jeep and stood up and walked to the bay door and looked out. Route 9 was filling up with motorcycles. They were coming from both directions, from the south, from the north, pulling off the road and into her lot, and then, when the lot filled, onto the shoulder and the grass past the shoulder. She watched them come in, a long, steady stream of them. Headlights still on in the pale morning, engines at idle. They were all kinds of bikes. Cruisers, touring bikes, a few sport bikes, and all kinds of riders, men and women, and a few who looked barely old enough. And they all had different cuts on their backs or no cuts at all. Different clubs and chapters and some with nothing. But in the middle of the lot, already off their bikes, were 9 people she recognized. Russell Briggs walked across the gravel toward the bay door with his helmet under his arm. He was followed by Deb and Carla and Arlo, whose arm was in a proper sling now from an actual hospital, and the others, all of them moving without urgency, calm and certain, like people who had decided something. Behind them, the lot held more motorcycles than Tessa could count. She tried anyway. She stopped at somewhere above 300 and realized she had lost track. Russell stopped in front of her. He reached into his cut and took out an envelope and held it out. Tessa didn't take it. What is that? That, Russell said, is 4 months of mortgage payments on this property. He paused. And then some. Enough that you've got a runway. Tessa looked at him. Then she looked at the lot behind him, at the hundreds of motorcycles parked in her gravel and on her grass and along the shoulder of Route 9. I didn't ask for, she started. No, Russell said. You didn't. You didn't ask for anything. He held her eyes. You opened the door. You reduced a dislocated shoulder at midnight because the alternative was leaving a kid in the rain for an hour. You fed people peanut butter and white bread without making them feel like they owed you for it. He paused. You know how rare that is? Tessa didn't say anything. We put out a call, Russell said. Iron Hammer chapters across the state. It went further than that. Some of these people drove 6 hours. Carla had come up beside him. She was holding something, a photograph in a small frame, the kind with a simple black border. She held it out to Tessa. It was a photograph of a diner, a small one in what looked like a strip mall with a hand-painted sign over the door and 2 picnic tables out front and a woman standing in the doorway who had Carla's jaw and Carla's eyes and was laughing at whoever was behind the camera. My dad's place, Carla said, in Seguin. She paused. He'd have liked you. Tessa took the photograph with both hands. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked up at the lot behind Russell, at the motorcycles still idling in from Route 9, at the riders stepping off their bikes and stretching and walking toward the shop in ones and twos. And she felt something she had not let herself feel in a long time. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated than that. Something that had to do with the sign above the tool cabinet and the folding chair where her father used to sit on Tuesdays and the third pot of coffee she'd made by herself at 6 in the morning 4 days ago. The bay's open, she said finally. If anybody's got something that needs looking at. Someone in the crowd laughed. Deb said something that made two people next to her laugh as well. The sun was coming up over Route 9 now. Actual sun, not just the suggestion of it. It came over the flat scrubland east of the highway and hit the shop and lit up the gravel and the chrome on 300 motorcycles. And for a moment, everything was very bright. Tessa went back to her workbench and picked up the socket wrench. She didn't put it down again for a long time.